Okay, great. Thank you, Lylan. Yes, we had some technical difficulties there at the very end or the very start here. So we're going to do our best to kind of muddle through. So Angie is going to advance my slides. So you might hear me say next slide for the next slide. But let's see, can you see my video? Everyone can see. I'm not sure if my video is up or not, but yeah, well, I'm gonna have to do this on my phone. So my computer decided to crap out here at the last minute. But so let's get started. This is a great webinar. I've had a lot of questions, a lot of people asking me to do a more in-depth case study, especially with fatigue and kind of the brain fog, things that we're all seeing in our practice. And there's more than one way to treat fatigue. There's more than one way to address this. So I'm going to go through how I approach this and hopefully give you some clinical pearls today about really what the testing that's available to us and how we look at the underlying causative factors of fatigue and address each patient individually. So let's begin. Next slide here. So a standard disclaimer, it's up to everybody to take this information and use it clinically with your judgment. Next slide. So, fatigue, pain, lack of function, low motivation, this is increasingly becoming an epidemic in our society. I think all of you are seeing it. Some of you might be experiencing it. So this webinar is designed to give you new insights and mechanisms of fatigue. I really want to leave everyone with some clinical pearls that they can take away to treat some of the really tough cases, non-responsive cases, severe fatigue. And I'll focus on a single case study and just go really in depth of how I treat it from start to finish. Next. So course objectives, I want to help increase the knowledge of all of the tests that we have. I mean, that's something that we all struggle with, but it's also a great thing that we have tests, so many tests that we can use. But how do we use them? So I'll give you some of the tests that I use and how I interpret it to use for some of these tough cases. And we'll talk about mitochondrial dysfunction. That's sort of the core of what we see happening with fatigue and the different organs and tissues that are affected by mitochondrial dysfunction. And we'll talk about some SNPs. We'll talk about insulin resistance, inflammation, all of the things that ultimately affect the that ultimately affect the mitochondria. So next slide. And so we'll talk a little bit about mitochondrial medicine, but I'm going to jump right into the case study. I'm just going to get, this is a little different than a lot of my lectures where I like to give all of the studies and all of the evidence-based, I do that in my courses that I teach. I do that in my lectures, but this one's going to be, again, what a lot of people have asked for is this, just take a case study from start to finish. So next. So obviously, just a few statistics. Fatigue is getting worse. We rank one of the highest in the countries on fatigue of all the countries. It affects our work, it affects our family, it affects our entire life. And we're working more and we're getting less sleep. Our lifestyle isn't conducive to health. So we are suffering, and our patients are suffering for it. Next slide. So over the past 5 years, obviously, we've had several things happen. It hasn't made stress and fatigue any better, but it's certainly even before that just continued to get worse. And we can see that it's actually not so much age related. I've given a talk with Doctors Data on preconception planning. You can go to their educational resources. I talk about preconception planning. What we're seeing here is that each generation is actually getting worse. So the millennials actually are experiencing more fatigue than the baby boomers, and that is, so it's not just age related. And we're seeing that it's often due to just this transgenerational buildup of genetic, epigenetic factors that affect the mitochondria. So next slide. And we see that actually for when we talk about chronic fatigue, when we talk about severe illness, which is more of an autoimmune, what we're seeing is that men do or women do experience it more than men. And we see this biphasic life peak. So it often happens in the teens, and for both men and women. But then later in life, probably after child rearing and just the mitochondrial damage starts to build up. So we see this biphasic lifespan peak of fatigue and illness and autoimmune start to happen. So next slide. So why are so many people fatigued? I don't need to tell you how many, because there's a lot and we see it in our practice, but why? So when we look at a case study, when we look at an individual with fatigue and brain fog and joint pain and just so many things that are happening in their body, they just feel overwhelmed all the time. We want to look at all of these factors, lifestyle, sleep, exercise, are they fasting, are they doing meditation? What I find too is life purpose. Finding that life purpose, not having that life purpose is a big stressor. One of my favorite authors is Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. And I like this quote: between the stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. And I think we don't, as a culture, give ourselves that freedom between stimulus and response. And so lifestyle and how we live our life and how we think about our life and our purpose of life certainly is a big factor that I don't want to get lost in the biochemistry of fatigue. So we're not going to talk much about the purpose of life today. We're going to go more into the biochemistry, but I think it's worth mentioning so it doesn't get lost in the bigger picture and in helping our patients. We look at genetics and epigenetics. Again, it's transgenerational amplification. Each generation is getting worse and worse. And we're not even, this case study is not even the worst of the worst, but it was pretty bad. But we can also use these principles to not just treat really bad cases, but to help sort of average people function better. So everything we're going to talk about today is going to help even average people function more optimally, function better. We see an increase in pollutants, plastics, heavy metals, EMFs, and it all leads to this mitochondrial dysfunction. We also have insulin resistance, nutritional deficiencies, chronic inflammation, infections, Epstein-Barr, dysbiosis, candida, COVID. All of these are starting to build up in people and add to the viral load, add to the bacterial load. And of course, we're seeing this rise in autoimmune. Next slide. So what is this rise in autoimmune? This is a great study that kind of put a lot of it together. Metabolic profiling indicates impaired pyruvate dehydrogenase function in chronic fatigue syndrome. What does that mean? It means that we are developing, what they've looked at is people with chronic fatigue syndrome, myalgic encephalomyelitis. It is an autoimmune against certain enzymes within the Krebs cycle, within the TCA cycle. So it's this altered carbohydrate oxidation. So we see that it is an autoimmune, and if we know it, if we approach it as an autoimmune, then we can look at the autoimmune triad and look at the genetics, look at the leaky gut, look at the environmental factors. Next slide. So in this study, it was just a really good study that they looked at the ability to burn carbohydrates and fats is altered and impaired in fatigue. And so in this study, they just used some branched chain amino acids because that's kind of a workaround in the Krebs cycle. And branched chain amino acids significantly improved fatigue. So that's something that I do employ a lot in my practice, especially if I suspect mitochondrial dysfunction, because breaking down the branched chain amino acids for energy is an easier pathway and isn't affected by the inflammation and mitochondrial dysfunction. So next slide. Another study here, a little bit later study, again, evidence for an autoimmune disease being, this fatigue that we're seeing is so many people, it's an autoimmune issue. So We don't have, just one single antibody that we can test for yet, but understanding that in most people it is an autoimmune issue. Next slide. So this is just a good sort of autoimmune triad summed up. So we get metabolic alteration, we have immune activation and dysregulation with chronic infections and dysbiosis, causes autonomic nervous system dysfunction, causes inflammation in the TCA cycle, and that is what leads to many of the factors that leads to this chronic fatigue. Next slide. So without mitochondria, there is no life. Without fully functioning mitochondria, there's no vitality. So again, we're not just helping people get out of bed and function better. We're helping people, do better in their life and function better and actually help solve the problems that we're all experiencing. Next slide. So I've talked about this before. I don't want to spend too much time, but here's some really good studies you can look at. The rise of mitochondria in medicine. The more we study, the more the biochemical and pathophysiological aspects of fatigue and disease are looked at. It ultimately all leads back to the mitochondria, and it leads to the leaky gut, nutritional deficiencies, the things we just talked about that affect the mitochondria. So when I do functional medicine consulting for doctors all over the world, and when I see that they're not getting the results, a lot of times what they're missing is this piece between the mitochondria and disease, mitochondria and illness. So understanding that the literature is replete with this proof of concept, proof of principle. Next slide. You can kind of keep going next. Keep going through that slide. This slide is just showing all of the outcomes of mitochondrial dysfunction. Everything from autonomic nervous dysfunction, fatigue, Alzheimer's, cancers, pain, epigenetics, infertility. All of it leads. All of it is going back to this mitochondrial dysfunction. Next slide. So thank you guys for being patient too, as I say next slide and next slide. My computer is if I can get it up, then we can switch over. But mitochondria are the main organelles affected by COVID-19. So again, it makes sense, and not just COVID-19, but most viruses. We're seeing it's the effect on the mitochondria that really do the damage. And so recovering from that, it means addressing mitochondria and mitochondrial health. So we have to be able to do that. And people who are more susceptible to Epstein-Barr reactivation and COVID-19 long hauler, those are people that have pre-existing mitochondrial dysfunction. Of course, we have the diseases that are the comorbidities and comortality, increase the mortality rates like heart disease, but those also are ultimately mitochondrial dysfunctions. Next slide. Yep, keep going. And we know that the mitochondria don't just produce energy. They're the playmakers in apoptosis, autophagy, senescence. So when we have mitochondrial uncoupling, when we have enzymes being attacked in the mitochondria, when we have the mitochondrial membrane being attacked by free radicals and oxidative lipopolysaccharides from the leaky gut, what ends up happening is the entire cell becomes dysfunctional, not just from lack of ATP, but actually the mitochondria directly affect how the microRNA and the DNA and epigenetics, how that DNA is functioning. So, so giving you just kind of a big overview here. Next slide. Mitochondria is the target of environmental toxicants. Next slide. So all of these toxins that we're exposed to end up damaging the mitochondria. Again, environmental pollutants. One of the mechanisms is it binds iron within the mitochondria. So sometimes you have to look at iron metabolism with people with chronic fatigue syndrome and just fatigue in general. And you want to look at ferritin. Ferritin is a good indicator of myoglobin, and myoglobin is a better indicator than serum iron of iron availability. So a lot of times people with mitochondrial dysfunction have low ferritin. Now, if it's we know ferritin is an acute phase reactant, so if there's a lot of acute systemic inflammation, then ferritin is going to be elevated. So you have to look at it from that clinical standpoint. Next slide. Keep going. Next slide. Yeah, we can skip through that, just repeating what I was saying. One of the things that does help is retinoids, because retinoids, like vitamin D, vitamin A, these help protect the mitochondria. So looking at vitamin D and looking at actually vitamin A as well. A lot of people miss vitamin A in their assessment of the retinoids. Again, mitochondria implicated in neuropathic pain. Next slides. Next slide. Here it just shows melatonin. Melatonin is something I use a lot in my practice, especially with mitochondrial dysfunction. Even if they're not having sleep issues, even if their melatonin levels are okay in the testing that we do, sometimes we still use super physiological amounts of melatonin short term because melatonin in itself repairs the mitochondria. It specifically triggers repair mechanisms, again, the microRNA repair mechanisms in the mitochondria. So just setting the stage of some of the importance. We can go on and on. I have a 12-hour lecture on mitochondria, but just setting the stage of how important it is and why we want to focus on it. So let's go into the how. Let's go into what we do and how we do it. So this is Kieran, a 57-year-old male. I mentioned him in my last webinar on testosterone dysfunction in doctor's data that I did a few months ago. So you can go back. I just mentioned him in terms of testosterone, but now I was getting a lot of requests to go deeper into this. So I presented in my office with lingering fatigue for over a year, joint pain, brain fog, shortness of breath, and a cough over a year after COVID-19. Normal BMI, so he didn't have all of these normal, he's overweight or heart disease or high blood pressure. He didn't have those kind of cofactors. So he ran. He seemed, and on all accounts, pretty healthy. Wasn't taking medications, worked out daily. So he contracted COVID-19 in March of 2020. He had fever, fatigue. He did have some anosmia and addusia. He had the respiratory distress. He didn't go to the hospital because at the time, people were dying in the hospital. So that was probably a smart thing on his part. But he just kind of toughed it out, and symptoms didn't really improve much. He had lingering respiratory distress, and he wasn't unhealthy. Again, he was taking vitamin D. The low-hanging fruit that we think about in this, in these cases aren't. It wasn't there. So he went back to the MD a couple months later, and the MD just described antibiotics. Of course, antibiotics that's not his issue. So the antibiotics ended up making it worse. Next slide. So he was told to get the flu, DTaP, COVID, and other vaccines when they came out. Immediately developed fever, shortness of breath, fatigue, and chest pains after getting all of these. I mean, even in children, we notice spread it out, let alone an older adult who's in distress. But we know that, but not everyone knows that. Then he was given albuterol for his cough and respiratory. And what does albuterol do? It weakens the immune system. So, he developed more mucus, and the productive cough persisted. So another couple of months went by, and he was given another round of amoxicillin and clavulanate. Again, that's his second or even third round. Diagnostic imaging was negative for pathology. And again, he takes a vitamin D, multivitamin, zinc, small amount of fish oil. He felt some benefit from those, but he just wasn't getting any better. Next slide. So this is what I do is I go through a blood chemistry panel, through LabCorp, Quest, just looking at all of these markers. And again, I'm going through this pretty quickly because there wasn't a lot. Again, we had to go further. Of course, if you're going to find insulin resistance, then that's something that you need to treat. But he didn't have overt insulin resistance. His kidney function was fine. Next slide. Yeah, uric acid wasn't elevated. Bun and creatinine ratio is fine. He didn't have anything too off. His magnesium red blood cell was a little off. I have a blood chemistry manual that is research and evidence based in terms of what are optimal levels. It's not just one standard deviation. That's not a good, because the whole population can get sicker. But these are evidence based, and really healthy people. What are healthy people ranges? You can go to my website to download that book. But healthy people are above a 6 in magnesium red blood cell. His albumin was high, which usually means outside of the healthy reference ranges, which usually means dehydration. And dehydration can often be tied to adrenal dysfunction. Why? Because adrenals secrete mineralocorticoids, and without the mineralocorticoids, even if you drink a lot of water, you don't absorb the water, you don't retain the water. So one of the hallmarks of adrenal dysfunction, adrenal fatigue, is this lack of mineralocorticoids as well. And a lot of times, if you feel like you're just drinking all the time and water is going right through you, you need to add more electrolytes. You need to have minerals and electrolytes in the water, or else it's actually going to make your adrenals worse, because the adrenals have to shunt into the mineralocorticoids and take what limited resources, DHEA and pregnenolone and sex hormones, into the mineralocorticoids. So I think electrolytes are often missed in the adrenal treatments, and he wasn't taking any electrolytes. Not only that, he was losing electrolytes because he didn't have enough mineralocorticoids, and he was drinking just purified water, and just having a few minerals in your water isn't enough. Like, you have to take a mineral supplement, an electrolyte supplement. One of the things that was normal for him, but I just want to mention, is phosphorus. A lot of times, if you ever heard the term phosphorus diabetes, I see this a lot with chronic fatigue. Phosphorus diabetes is when the phosphorus is low, the kidneys are dysfunctional. It has nothing to do with diabetes, but it's phosphorus diabetes, and the kidneys are dumping phosphorus, and that is also an indicator of fatigue and mitochondrial dysfunction. So there's many ways it manifests, but I just wanted to mention that because he didn't have it, but I do see it very commonly. Next slide. This is phosphate diabetes. So, and again, we're seeing it more and more in chronic fatigue syndrome. And so the treatment for phosphate diabetes is, adrenal support, kidney support, increasing phosphates in the diet. Ribose is a precursor to ATP. So we do a lot of ribose when we see low phosphate, but that's another indicator of chronic fatigue and mitochondrial dysfunction. So he didn't have that because he was still, he was taking some stuff, but we do see this a lot. Next slide. Okay, he did have some mildly elevated liver enzymes. Could have been due to the antibiotics, could have been due to just some of the inflammation, mitochondrial dysfunction. His ferritin wasn't too bad. His vitamin, again, he was taking a vitamin D. Cholesterol, triglycerides, pretty normal. Lab companies like to make LDL less than 100 just to sell statin drugs, in my opinion, but that's not an issue, especially since his HDL was fine. Okay, next slide. So, his homocysteine was fine, his CRP, again, these are all some of the, like I said, low-hanging fruit of oh yeah, this is pretty obvious. But he didn't have that. His thyroid was pretty fine. I mean, not just pretty fine. I mean, he wasn't, his total T3 was a little bit low, but his TSH was okay. Thyroid wasn't his big issue. He did have mildly elevated reverse T3, which could be an indicator of inflammation. That's one of my best inflammatory markers, actually. The evidence is unclear as to whether reverse T3 actually blocks regular T3. I think it can, but more importantly, it's almost it's a really good rule-in test for inflammation and a body really far into disease. So next slide. By the way, this is all, if you want to know where I run all of these tests, you can email me, and I can give you my menu and panel of tests that includes many of the doctor's data tests that we'll go through today. His sex hormone binding globulin was okay. He didn't have ANA, didn't have RA latex. What I'm going over right now is what I run on almost all of my patients. Next slide. His hemoglobin, red blood cells were okay. A little bit high because of the dehydration. His MCV was elevated, so that could be a lack of B12, lack of folate. His homocysteine was okay, but that doesn't always rule out methylation issues, as we'll see in this case study. So you have to think about the biochemistry. When I teach my students, when I teach other doctors about functional medicine, one of my favorite things is, a good doctor knows what to do, a great doctor knows why. You want to look at the biochemistry, understanding the biochemistry. Don't look at labs as if it's low, it must be this, if it's high, it must be this, if it's normal, everything's normal. Understand what each analyte is telling you and where it's coming from. So he actually wasn't eating a lot of protein, and so homocysteine isn't going to be elevated, and it's going to cover up a methylation issue, which is why sometimes I'll do a methionine challenge. I'll have people do 2 to 3 grams of methionine for about 3 or 4 days before running a homocysteine test. But I also, more often than that, I just run a SAMe, because that's ultimately the ultimate methyl donor. If they don't have enough SAMe, then they have a methylation issue, regardless of their B12 status, folate status, homocysteine status. Next slide. He did have some Epstein-Barr. I don't need to go into the amount of evidence that shows COVID-19 can reactivate Epstein-Barr. We want to look at titers. So in traditional medicine, we say, oh, it's not a reactivation unless IgM is elevated, right? But that's not true. What we're seeing is that IgM almost never gets reactivated in Epstein-Barr. It doesn't even get reactivated in herpes when herpes is active. What we look at are titer levels. And whenever I see a titer level of, the BCA or the nuclear antigens, then especially greater than 600, then we know that it's most likely very active in his body. So that's something we, looking at the viral support is huge for a patient like this. Mycoplasma, he also had mycoplasma, and those are also pretty high numbers. Again, he had the lung issue. We know COVID-19 can also reactivate the mycoplasma. So that's an issue that we have to address as well. And antibiotics don't do it well. So we have to do it with nutrition, which I'll get to. Next slide. I often run food sensitivity tests. Why? Because it can give me an idea of the IgG and IgA action in the body, what foods are triggering IgG and IgA, and also it's a good diagnostic indicator of leaky gut. Obviously, if you have a lot of IgG reactive foods, then in your blood, then clearly those proteins are leaking into your bloodstream and causing a lot of cross-reactivity. So in fatigue and the upregulation of autoimmune and this cross-reactivity of foods and antibodies to self-tissue, it's really important to remove these. And he clearly had a lot of IgG and IgA responses to his food. So that's an indicator that he had pretty significant leaky gut. That's kind of pathognomonic. Now, again, this is a rule-in test, not a rule-out test. This test doesn't rule out leaky gut, but certainly if you have a lot of these, then it's a rule-in. Next slide. So we had a couple more here. We can go next slide. This is just kind of what I do. Eggs are really high, and gluten and gliadin was off the chart, and he was eating that a lot. Without running these tests, you just really don't know how food is affecting you. So you can put someone on an anti-inflammatory diet. Now, here's the caveat about running food, a little clinical pearl. Don't run food tests if they've been on a restricted, a restricted diet, because you have to be eating a lot of these foods in order for it to be accurate. Just like testing for celiac, whether kids or an adult, they have to be eating 10 grams, 5 to 10 grams of gluten every day for 4 months in order for that test to be accurate, because these will be elevated in response to exposures. Doesn't mean everything you're eating is going to cause an elevation, though. It's only the things that you're eating and have an immune response to. So again, on my website and in my classes, I go through how to interpret these tests a little bit more in depth. My goal today is to give you an idea of the tests we run and how we interpret it and treat it. Next page. Yeah, another one. We also see that the Candida screen was a little bit high. And so that's often a clue for me to run a stool test. At that point, I'm going to run a stool test to see what levels of Candida or what other things are in there, because he's clearly reacting to Candida and other yeast and mold. Next slide. So leaky gut, he clearly has leaky gut. How does the leaky gut affect the mitochondria? Next slide. So we see that in chronic fatigue syndrome, even in clinical trials, normalizing leaky gut helps with chronic fatigue syndrome. And one of the things that damages the mitochondria is lipopolysaccharides from the gram-negative bacteria. You start to get the microbiome encroachment into the subluminal layer. You get the interleukin activation, and you also get cross-reactivity, and you get the lipopolysaccharides and other endotoxins. So all of these directly break down mitochondrial function. It is a real issue that needs to be addressed. And again, a lot of people just don't know to look for it. And just putting someone on a healthier diet and a probiotic, it's not going to cut it. Okay, next page. Again, this, evidence, glutamine and acetylcysteine, zinc, these are things that we all hopefully use in our leaky gut protocols. Next page. Again, mitochondria showing that it gets destroyed, and it affects your circadian clock and metabolic pathways and all of that. So next slide. The mitochondria and the axis, again, how leaky gut affects directly the mitochondria. You get butyrate suffers because it's, you get a lot of gram-negative bacteria. Those aren't putting out short-chain fatty acids, at least not butyrate, which is essential for mitochondrial function. You get all of the interleukins, tumor necrosis factor alpha, which directly cause micropore damage in the mitochondria. So next slide. And again, lipopolysaccharides there. Next slide. Looks like, okay. Short chain fatty acid activity. I like Doctor's data. Dr. Quigg just put out a little newsletter a couple weeks ago talking about the best way to increase short chain fatty acid activity is fiber. That's kind of the only proven, or at least, there's fecal transplants and probiotics, but those are short-lived unless you are feeding the good bacteria with a lot of fiber. But then you have to make sure that the patient or the person is able to break down the fiber, and they're eating the right types of fiber, ensuring that they have enough hydrochloric acid and those things. But the studies with the metabolome and the microbiome and its effect on the mitochondria and obesity is phenomenal. I just read a study looking at fecal transplant, and it was a placebo-controlled trial, randomized control. And I thought to myself, I read the study because I thought to myself, how do they do a placebo in a fecal transplant? That's a good question to ask. And it was actually pretty smart. What they did was they just gave them the, randomized, they gave the control group their own poop back. So I thought that was pretty clever. But what it showed was, dramatic effect in the improvement of mitochondrial function but it has to be the right donor. So if anyone's doing fecal transplants out there, you can contact me or interested in doing that. I don't do a lot of them, but you have to get, the key for it to work is to get the right donor, and then teaching the patient to eat well. It's only if you are healing the leaky gut and eating the right things, then you can do long term. And again, probiotics and the spore probiotics, those are all good short term, but the evidence long term is very weak, because you have to feed the good bacteria and for it to actually grow, colonize, and become a permanent part of the microbiome. Next page. And again, those things are good to do, but I like that article just showing that unless you're teaching your patients to eat that well, then it's going to go back. So again, just mitochondrial stress. You can look at the highlights of the different acids that E. coli and other gram-negative bacteria secrete that directly interfere with the mitochondria, triggering things like chronic fatigue, colon cancer, brain fog, all of these things. Next page. Leaky gut leads to mitochondrial dysfunction, which leads to more leaky gut, which leads to more mitochondrial dysfunction and systemic illness and disease. So this is the cycle that we have to break. Next page. So stool tests are foundational in my practice, especially for fatigue. I believe that the microbiome and leaky gut and this leaky gut mitochondrial axis is probably the greatest clinically relevant medical discovery in the last 50 years, and we continue to learn more and more about it. So mastering this in your clinical practice is worth every effort, and it will make you a great practitioner. And we have so many tools now. We have so many tests that we can look at. So the dysbiosis score, I would say just be careful with that. Just the dysbiosis score is kind of a mathematical algorithmic, based on the diversity and number, but that doesn't mean that there isn't significant dysbiotic bacteria in a patient sample. So I always have to tell my patients the dysbiotic index there is a helpful tool, but it's more, again, a rule-in test, not a rule-out test. It's just looking at some of the, it's an algorithmic kind of thing that looks at the number and diversity and things. So, he did have a lot, for Firmicutes. He was short in some of the proteobacteria, or he had little Firmicutes. He had a lot of proteobacteria. So definitely some dysbiosis. This first page shows kind of at a glance, his elastase was low, so his pancreas wasn't functioning well. His exocrine pancreas wasn't functioning well. If your exocrine pancreas isn't functioning well, then your microbiome is almost always going to be off, because it's not secreting the bicarbonates, it's not secreting the lipases, the chymotrypsin and trypsin, so digestion is going to be off. Next page. So, you can go through these. I just want to show you what's tested in this test. A lot of different bacteria. You can tailor a probiotic to what you see here. Next page. And again, next page, just showing some of these. We can go through these pretty fast. And we look, no parasites, and no big viruses. Ruling out some of the major stuff. No roundworms, nematodes, those kinds of things. Next page. But that's giving you an idea. We can stop here. Giving you an idea of just the comprehensiveness of this test here. By doctor's data. So what he did, so he had a couple of odd imbalanced bacteria, the Cochuria rhizophilia and strep. So I see a lot of Streptococcus, and that's that's a gram-negative bacteria, and it's a pretty high growth, 4 pluses, is a really high growth. You don't want a 4+ of strep in your gut, and I see that a lot. So we will need to put him on a dysbiosis protocol. We need to, we can do it orally. We don't need to do with the fecal transplants, but you can do it with a combination of antimicrobials, probiotics, and diet. And again, a high fiber diet. Next page, next slide. So his elastase was low, and his pH was really low, again, because the pancreas wasn't working well, secreting the bicarbonates. But short chain fatty acids were good. Not too bad, but lactoferrin, lysozyme, calprotectin, those were all low. So ruling out ulcerative colitis, Crohn's, that kind of thing. Next slide. So I have a dysbiosis protocol. It's not the same for everybody. It kind of depends on, what their culture and sensitivity was on this test. A lot of times they'll do a culture and sensitivity. Grapefruit seed extract seems to be across the board kind of your most powerful natural antimicrobial. But the research shows doing this 10 days on and 4 days off kind of thing for a couple of months. So I can give you my protocol that you can then adjust to your patient. But here is kind of what I do. You can email me, Dr. Brandon Lundell. You can go to my website at drbrandonlundell.com. Next page. So I do neurotransmitter testing as well, especially with brain fog and just not, lack of motivation, fatigue, the hormonal neuroendocrine, axis is really, really important to assess. And we can see a lot of his excitatory neurotransmitters, PEA and tyrosine and tyramine, those are really low. Dopamine is really low as well. We look at the dopamine and the breakdown products of dopamine, and those are high. That indicates, again, high MAO activity, which is inflammation. Serotonin is really low. So of course he's not going to be thinking well. How can the body make the neurotransmitters, let alone process correctly and break down correctly the neurotransmitters if the mitochondria aren't functioning? So in the meantime, while we get the mitochondria functioning, he may need some amino acid neurotransmitter support, tryptophan, tyrosine, some maca, or some mucuna, things that help support his neurotransmitter levels, just until his systems start coming back online. Next. We also, like I said, heavy metals and pollutants and toxins, those are such a huge hit to the mitochondria. So I do want to rule those things out or in if that's an issue. We don't always go after the heavy metals first, because that can cause some detox reactions if the patient isn't ready for it. But hey, I want to make sure that that's something that we're not really dealing with at a big level, because if that is true, then we need to start chelating, and I'll do IVs at that point. So this is a pre-provocative test on the left, and then post-provocative, which I use DMSA. Again, you can email me for those protocols, and we do see that his lead did come up pretty high. His mercury came up pretty high, and yeah, that's something then we need to be aware of, that his mitochondria are probably being burdened with some level of heavy metals. It may not be the first thing we go after, but if it's something that you miss, then it could affect his ability or your patient's ability to get better. Next. I do a micronutrient, especially if I suspect autoimmune, because this test takes white blood cells and it multiplies, it cultures it, and it adds single ingredients. So this is not a level test. This is not measuring the level of this nutrient in your blood. It's measuring how much your cell needs it to function optimally. So we want everyone to be pegged up at the high green, right? Because that means they're replete. So we can see a lot of his B vitamins were a little bit not optimal. And then if it's a black circle, then it's insufficient. And if it's a red circle, then it's really deficient. So we can see, and again, his minerals were low. He was taking zinc, but he wasn't absorbing it, and he wasn't utilizing it very well. Calcium was low, and even though he was taking vitamin D, his body still needed more to function optimally. Why? Because the mitochondria weren't being addressed. And you can take all the vitamin D you want, but if you're not supporting the mitochondria, we have a lot of vitamin D and retinoid receptors, like I showed the study in the beginning, in the mitochondria, and also for autophagy. And he wasn't able to really actually utilize it. So you shouldn't need 10, 20,000 IUs a day unless you're missing the mitochondrial piece. If the mitochondria is functioning, people do not need usually more than 5,000 IUs every day or two. So next. And all of his antioxidants were really low. And alpha lipoic acid is something I use a lot in my practice, especially for fatigue. Why? Because it's probably the best single nutrient for mitochondrial health. It's not the only one, but it's the best single nutrient for mitochondrial health. So anytime we have a mitochondrial issue, then alpha lipoic acid is certainly one of the go-tos. CoQ10 wasn't optimal. His glutathione wasn't optimal. His cysteine wasn't optimal either. So doing some N-acetylcysteine as well. Next. We also looked at his methylation pathway. So looked at some of his SNPs. We know he was actually homozygous for, I believe, or he was heterozygous for one, which is likely why his homocysteine wasn't really elevated. But this does not rule out that he has a methylation issue. So you want to run a plasma SAMe level. Next. So this is a test, again, from Dr. Data, and we see that his SAMe was not optimal by any means. If you are undergoing any kind of challenge, immune challenge, stress, that SAMe needs to be, as high as possible, as high as is healthy, certainly on the other percentiles. So he was pretty deficient, and so he does have a methylation issue, likely due to nutrient deficiencies, leaky gut. Again, the mitochondria, the methylation enzymes are not going to work if the mitochondria isn't working. Next. And this is his saliva test, and his morning. Why I circled the morning is the morning cortisol is probably the most sensitive indicator of how much reserve that organ has, that gland has, the adrenal glands. So we do see that he was low in the morning and he dropped down the rest of the day. We also see this opposite circadian pattern, this negative circadian pattern, where it's the nighttime cortisol is elevated, higher than the evening cortisol. That has been linked to many types of cancers. That's been linked to chronic fatigue. It's been linked to autoimmune. It affects sleep. So maybe some phosphatidylserine at night, having him exercise first thing in the morning, retraining his circadian rhythm, not eating for 3-4 hours before bed at least. So that the morning cortisol, though, is one that you want to watch first, because it can take a year or two for all of the adrenal markers to come back into normal levels. But you're on the right track if that morning cortisol starts to move. So his DHEA was really low. I also have done a lot of research. I mean, I researched COVID, SARS, and other viruses for over 10 years before the pandemic. And, I knew the DHEA, and I actually did one for Doctor's Data, a webinar on it as well. It's on my website. And without DHEA and melatonin, that's probably one of the greatest predictors of mortality and morbidity. So, looking at DHEA levels, looking at melatonin levels, more so than even vitamin D. Of course, they all kind of go together because the patient's not healthy and things are happening. Next slide. Things are happening to the mitochondria. So his testosterone was low as well. Next slide. And these are just a couple of the studies, an inconvenient variable, how sex hormones impact T cell responses. So he wasn't able to actually get good T cell and B cell responses without DHEA and testosterone. So this is a really good study. I quoted quite a few in the lecture on nutrition and viral immunity. Next. Another good study, sex hormones regulate the innate immune cells and promote sex differences and respiratory virus infection. It's why death rates were higher in males, because males tend to have lower DHEA and testosterone, as they get older. Next. And sure enough, his melatonin was not robust. So he had all of these risk factors for immune dysfunction, autoimmune, chronic fatigue, long hauler. So, taking a vitamin D, taking a zinc, quercetin, whatever those, those are all great. But this is what really you need to take a look at. We need to take a deeper look into the neuroendocrine, gastroenterology, enterologic system of the patient. Next. Another slide just showing increased DHEA actually has been known in the literature for quite some time. This was back in 1997 that DHEA showed significant reduction in those cytokine storms. So without the DHEA, you're not able to regulate, and testosterone, you're not able to regulate those T cells. And so you can get overproduction and underproduction of the cytokines. Next. Another DHEA actually prevents vitamin E loss, and melatonin does as well in the lungs. So he was having this chronic lung issue, and post-COVID, and of course we see why it really affected him and others much more. So next. And these principles can be applied to all of our patients. Like I said, melatonin is something that I use a lot of. Usually you don't need a lot though. You want to just restore healthy levels, 500 micrograms, 1 milligram, maybe 2 is all you really need for most people. You can do 5 to 10 milligrams for a week or two, but I don't like to do it more than that, because there is some evidence that you can develop melatonin resistance. It is a hormone, let's not forget. And with any hormone, if you do super physiological amounts of a hormone, you're going to get receptor downregulation. So just be aware of that. But melatonin, especially if you're low, is so critical in regulating the mitochondria and the mitochondria in the immune system and the T cells. Next. This is just showing everything that melatonin does. It's a pleiotropic hormone, does many, many different things in the body. Next. Another study just showing how estrogens control the mitochondria. So if you have too much or too little of the estrogens, it really is not going to be conducive to healthy mitochondrial protection. If you have estrogen dominance, progesterone also is critical. So this hormone, this endocrine mitochondrial connection should not be overlooked. And let's not forget, what I tell people, my students all the time, is that where are hormones made? Hormones are made in the mitochondria, in the endoplasmic reticulum. So without mitochondrial function, even if the glands were healthy, then you wouldn't be able to make the hormones that you need. So a lot of hormonal imbalances also come down to mitochondrial dysfunction. And my hope after today is that you kind of get that now, and that's something that's on your radar, and it's something that we can test for. Next. There's a new test by Doctors Data called the HUMAP, and it's a urine test looking at cortisol levels. This is actually not from this patient, to be clear, but I wanted to put this on there because it's a new tool that we have, for those of you that haven't been using urinary assessments. But we can look at cortisol levels. This patient clearly does not have a lot of urinary cortisol, which usually reflects blood levels and production levels. And you can look at cortisol to cortisone, which is instrumental in immune function. If your cortisol to cortisone ratio is really low, or if it's too high, then it's going to suppress the immune system. Next. And we can look at pregnenolone. We can look at progesterone. It's one of the only ways to really look at pregnenolone levels. And I think pregnenolone is underutilized nutraceutical in practice. It's safe. It tends to be safer. As we can see, pregnenolone can feed progesterone directly, but it can also help balance the progesterone ratios. It tends not to increase the estrogens. It doesn't increase the progesterone too much. It's very safe. I like precursors. It has very, very weak estrogenic activity, and therefore it actually becomes protective, and it can protect from over estrogen receptor activity in both estrogen receptor alpha and beta. So I use pregnenolone and DHEA often together, not only to support the adrenal function, but also hormonal balance. Next. You guys are awesome. Thank you for being patient with us, and as we're tag teaming these slides. And thank you, Angie, for doing it. It's forcing you to pay attention too. So, but yes, this is the HUMAP, and I encourage everybody to look at. I mean, it is just probably the largest analyte test out there for the hormonal system. You can look at methylation activity. You can look at cytochrome 1A1, 1B1 activity, whether you're detoxifying into the 2s, 4s, 16s, if you're methylating those. So a lot of information to be gleaned from that. Next. And I'll do a webinar on this HUMAP, down the road as well. I've been doing urinary testing, for some time, and this is by far the most in-depth test out there. So you can look at your androstenediones, you can look at your androgens, how they're being broken down, your 5-alpha reductase, 5-beta reductase activity. Next. So let's get back to Kieran. So what did we do? Let's summarize what we saw. And I know we started a little bit late, and I'm almost done here. So make the correct diagnosis first. Nutrient deficiencies, chronic viral infections, mitochondrial dysfunction, the pollutants that he had, leaky gut, and his hormonal imbalance. These are all the things that need to be addressed if we're going to be successful in helping patients like this. Next. So treatment approach. Now, I use the 3-legged stool approach, and I use this because for my students and my patients, because the idea is that each leg must be strong and intact for it to work. It's not going to work if you just have one part of this, really strong, and you can't make up for a missing by having a missing leg by having the other legs really strong. So the lifestyle, again, the exercise, stress and meditation and spiritual needs and sleep, all of that lifestyle piece, the nutrition, which is diet and supplementation, and then kind of our structure and professional support, chiropractic, massage, neuromuscular integration, acupuncture, it's the things that help, why we have practitioners that kind of help the body become healthier. Next. So the focus is on his mitochondria, his hormone, his nutrient repletion. So in addition to his multivitamin, fish oils, probiotics, we initiated the immune protocol. Again, I have that published. You can go to my website and download it, or email me. It's been very successful. Like I said, I studied SARS specifically for over 10 years before the pandemic hit. It was not a matter of if, but when. So I was just, preparing for that to happen. And so studying, what herbs, what Chinese medicine, what nutrients worked the best, because we had, 20 years of COVID almost being around, or SARS being around, and what worked for it and what didn't. We initiated an anti-inflammatory diet. Also on my website, we started with a slow amount of exercise. The two things that I use in my practice a lot that I would encourage other practitioners to look at is hyperbaric oxygen and IV nutrition. I have a modified Myers that I've come up with that seems to work a lot better for me and for my patients than the traditional Myers. And I'll give everyone my website so you can download it, or I have all of these protocols for purchase that you can download. Again, I've been doing this almost 20 years. Hard to admit that sometimes, but this is my whole practice in a course. So that modified Myers is really helpful. It's got leucovorin in it. It's got methyl B12. It's got trace minerals, those kinds of things. But I use hyperbaric. You want to go to at least 9 psi, 8 liters per minute of oxygen, and at least twice a week, if not more than that. If you have a higher pressure chamber, great. If you have a 4 psi, that's fine too. You just it just takes longer to get the results. But the research, I don't have time to go into the research today of just how incredible that can be if you have the 3-legged stool, if you have the nutrition. If you do hyperbaric to a patient like this without feeding them the antioxidants and the mitochondria support, you're going to burn out the mitochondria even more. And this is why there are some studies in the literature that are kind of inconclusive. Well, it helped some people, but it didn't help others. It's because people aren't addressing the mitochondria as well. We have to step out of the scientific medical model of just applying a single treatment and expecting good results. It's not going to happen. That's what functional medicine is here for. Next. So we did methylation support. We did mushrooms with a lot of glycans. Cordyceps is great. Reishi. I mean, lots of evidence of that for that. Sulforaphane is one of my favorite things. Vitamin D, again, the omegas, N-acetylcysteine, milk thistle, and other liver support. Tribulus for the adrenal, or for the testes and for testosterone production. Of course, we did DHEA and melatonin. The adaptogens, andrographis also has decades of evidence against viruses. L-carnitine for his, I didn't talk much about L-carnitine, but that's essential. CoQ10 is essential, and the research shows you have to do at least 400 milligrams a day. And of course, the anti-inflammatories, curcumin, resveratrol, quercetin, green tea extract, whatever your favorites are, olive leaf extract, and alpha-lipoic acid. These are the things that work, and we have to be comfortable telling our patients that, look, we're trying to support many different processes at once, and he needs to take these things if he's going to get better. Next. Let's skip through all these, because this is just the evidence of what I just showed you. Okay, these are just some of the evidence of what I do for mitochondria. We already went into, but sulforaphane. We can skip through that. Broccoli sprouts is one of my favorite things. EGCG, green tea extract is great. CoQ10. I just gave you a couple of studies to chew on. Grapeseed extract is actually really helpful. There's a combination product that I use that has alpha-lipoic and grapeseed extract in it, not grapefruit seed. That's for the dysbiosis, but grapeseed extract. Next. Yep, D-ribose is also, one of the most underutilized things for fatigue. But again, it has to be done all together. Next. Yep, keep going. Panax ginseng, these are part of my adaptogens. Panax ginseng acts directly on the mitochondria. Rhodiola is excellent for that as well. These are part of my adaptogens. Next. So now this is what we did. And just 3 months later, we can see that his morning cortisol came up. The others didn't. Like I said, those are going to be later. But the morning cortisol came up. And that means that while he's sleeping, he's able to start repleting. The cells are starting to regranulate at night. It's not enough for the rest of the day, but that morning cortisol is going to shift first if you're doing the right things. His DHEA came up, but not enough. So next page. And this is really good in just 3 months. His testosterone came up, but again, not enough. It went from, I think, 20 to 32. Next. So we added DHEA, we added more testosterone herbs. And then 6 months later, we can see all of his adrenals started to come back online, and he wasn't having that nighttime cortisol elevation. And his DHEA, we kind of overshot the mark a little bit with DHEA, but that's okay because that's why we test. And so we were able to back him off on this. Next. But his testosterone came back to good levels in just 9 months, which doesn't always happen. This is why we test. And if you do everything with the mitochondria, if you do this complete approach, then patients get better. Next page. Next slide. So all of his symptoms after 3 months improved significantly. We saw that. 6 months, he's back to feels like he's back to his normal. But then our job isn't just to get people back to normal, it's to improve, to be even better than they were before. And that's certainly how we felt after 9 to 12 months. So we've done the testing and treatment for heavy metals, neurotransmitters, the cognitive plasticity, and his athletic performance. He started running again. And this sort of approach, I would say, not just protocol, has worked for over 90% of the cases that I've seen over the years. And for him, the hormonal piece was I think the really missing key in my opinion. Next. So thank you everyone for hanging in there and hanging with us with our technical difficulties. I think that actually worked out pretty well. We do have this recorded, so you can listen to it again. I know I went through a lot of information, but if you like the way I teach, if you like this information, here is some more educational opportunities. I've developed a functional medicine and nutritional pathology certification program. It's been around for more than 5 years, 6 years. I've had thousands of doctors take it. It's one of the most comprehensive functional medicine programs out there. It's a self-paced program. Next page. You get a certificate at the end. It's about 100 hours. And after you go through it, you take some tests and you can get the certificate. Next. There's 6 modules looking at everything from nutritional testing and methylation, autoimmune, gastroenterology from A to Z, endocrinology 1 and 2, all of the endocrine systems, preconception planning, cardiometabolic, mitochondria, a lot of case studies. I make it really practical. So you can do each module, any module by itself, or you can do the entire course. I recommend doing it. Each course is standalone, but I recommend doing it in order. And so if you buy the bundle, then it's about $1,000 off. And it's got all my protocols. It's got everything in that, everything I use in my practice. I also do functional medicine mentorship. So if you're interested in doing that, then you can contact me. I only take a few people at a time to go through the mentorship because you have a lot of one-on-one with me going through case studies and going through the material. So for those people who listened today and stuck it out, if you want my entire course, then I have an additional $500 off the entire course until Friday with the code DD September 500, or you can just call us or email us and we can walk you through how to download the whole course. Next. So it's drbrandonlundell.com. And, thank you guys for listening. I always have fun with these case studies. It always spurs more questions than it answers. So we'll attempt to go through a few if those of you who want to stick around. Thanks everyone for listening, and thank you, Doctors Data, for having me again and supporting this kind of educational experience.